Hello everyone, my name is Paul. Welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic day. I hope that you've enjoyed your Sunday. Unfortunately, that does usually mean the start to the work week tomorrow, as tomorrow is Monday. But I hope that everyone has had a great weekend. I hope that you guys are enjoying yourselves. And I hope, of course, that you're safe, that your friends and your family are safe. And if not, I hope you find that safety and security in the very near future. When it comes to today, there wasn't a lot of big news. There just wasn't. In Ukraine itself, which I know is a lot of what you people are here for, there wasn't a lot of information coming out today. It was very quiet on all aspects of it. But we do have some pretty interesting topics nonetheless, and I please implore you guys to ask questions throughout the video or throughout the stream. I want to be able to answer questions, maybe kind of talk about some subjects a little bit different. And try and explain some of this stuff to you if I can, and at least give my input onto it to the best of my ability. So feel free to do that throughout the video, but most importantly, a lot of this stuff isn't great. It's usually pretty bad news. It's usually the kind of stuff that makes it onto, people's, social media and onto making government statements and stuff. Usually it's about bad stuff. It's very seldomly about good things. And we here can luckily be the news that gives back. You guys, as the community, allow us to do that. So please check out the video description below. We actually hit a cool milestone where it's so many different fundraiser links that we physically cannot put descriptions with them. But please check them out. Some of them go directly supporting the war effort in Ukraine. A lot of them are humanitarian. I please implore you to also check out the ones that aren't about Ukraine, the ones that have to deal with other locations as well, whether that's in the U.S. or whether that's in Africa, especially Southeast Asia. Please go check out all of those. All of these organizations, 80% or more of your donations actually go to helping the cause, if not more, and less than 20% actually go to salaries and administration costs. So be sure to check those all out. A lot of the other locations outside Ukraine aren't receiving the funding that they normally would, and that's causing some pretty drastic impacts on people's lives in other regions. So please be sure to check that stuff out. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and roll right into the news. And the first thing we actually have here is coming out of Cherkasy Oblast, which is where Russian missiles actually ended up impacting fields within the Cherkasy Oblast. And they set fire to some local fields to destroy some local farms. But we can take a look at some of the damage here. As you can see, some of those fires raging. Not everything is ready for harvest here in Ukraine. A lot of this stuff is still waiting, like for corn, for instance. That won't be ready to harvest for at least another month or two. And then you're talking about a lot of wheat, which is quite literally, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of the world, so a lot of wheat. They're going through the harvest right now, and you can see some of the ordnance being dropped here is absolutely massive in size. This crater is deeper than a person is tall, and that kind of crater is only created with a very significant sized warhead. And these are being shot at cities, these are being shot at fields, these are being shot all over the place in Ukraine. Over 630 cruise and ballistic missiles have been fired in Ukraine thus far, and as we've seen many of the strikes ourselves right here on the channel, it should come as no surprise that most of these are not hitting their intended targets, or if they are hitting their intended targets, those targets are of course a war crime. Most of what we see being hit is civilian infrastructure. Kharkiv, for instance, receives anywhere from 6 to 8 ballistic missiles every single day, mostly Iskander-M missiles fired from Belgorod. As we jump over here, we can see this is near Alchevsk. This is actually outside. This is Perevolsk, which is in the Donetsk, kind of the region of Donetsk, Luhansk. And we see here where Russian forces are continuing to reposition themselves along this front line. The Russian forces are conducting a tactical pause. And when I mean a tactical pause, I don't mean that there still isn't fighting ongoing. There certainly is. There's certainly fighting ongoing. There's certainly offensives and counteroffensives. But what it is they're minor. They are very minor gains and losses on both sides of the conflict. That's really causing the fluidity of the situation. Everyone is trying to outmaneuver each other. Everyone's kind of looking for a break in the lines. Everyone's looking for a gap. Everyone's trying to exploit, a weakness of your opponent. And that's just the nature of this war. The front line, as I've said before, is much more like a guitar string when it's been plucked. It's constantly waving back and forth. For simplicity's sake and limitation's sake, we can only, with limited knowledge, we have to put them in some kind of a fixed position, relative fixed position as to where they're generally speaking about when it comes to these front lines. But Russian forces are continuing to reposition themselves. You see a BTG has moved through the area of Alchevsk, essentially, today. They are basically moving into these positions. Most of these units were fighting in other locations, especially around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, and also some of the other 8 axes of advance within the Luhansk Oblast. Since the Luhansk Oblast has been captured at this point, by the Russians and now is under occupation, they're now going to be moving to other supporting and main efforts throughout the region, whether that is going to be in areas such as, whether that we're talking about Bakhmut or Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, we're talking about possibly the Kherson Oblast, there could be a push in Zaporizhia, as we have seen quite a significant amount of military buildup in the Zaporizhia Oblast. So there's a lot of fluidity to this situation, but we can go ahead and take a look here at some of these vehicles en route. So it would appear that there is no... We can see, they have MLRS systems that are on their way here. And we're going to continue seeing this. A vast quantity of Russian equipment is going to be that artillery. Well, they also have a massive amount of armored forces. This is a mechanized armored force that they use. The Russians actually, in their military, do not have light infantry. They are not a light infantry kind of set military. Their doctrine is based off of a heavy usage of artillery and heavy usage of armor. So basically all of their forces are mechanized, and they are very artillery dependent when they're getting ready to do these pushes or conducting operations. They also do not have very good coordination between their commands. Their command and control, communications, and logistics are really issues that they struggle with, as well as a general combined arms doctrine. And the main topic of the night, as we all know, is unfortunately, this is the 8-year anniversary of the downing of MH-17, or Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, in 2014. The circumstances surrounding MH-17 really kind of show you what is happening within this conflict. And it really shows you that the conflict is, 8 years old. It's not just, this isn't a conflict that started, in February with the main invasion. This is a conflict that's been ongoing for 8 years. And it truly has been. The Russian rhetoric, and a lot of rhetoric right now, is, the invasion started in February. That's what everyone cares about right now. Well, what we have to remember is the fact that the revolution, the Maidan Revolution, took place in 2014. Crimea was annexed in 2014. The war in the Donbass started in 2014. The downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 happened in 2014. And the only way that these things happened is because of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation in 2014 went into Crimea and here into the Donbass in order to assist separatist forces. And they also annexed Crimea in 2014 by pushing forces into there, which, by the way, were not marked with Russian insignias. In fact, none of them were marked. They had no official insignias. That's why they got the moniker Little Green Men. So this is just Russian forces pushing into an area, breaking the Geneva Convention while doing so because they weren't identified as forces, and therefore causing instability in the country of Ukraine. On top of this instability it was already facing due to the fact they were having a revolution at this time. And the very small separatist force that was here in Ukraine was getting pretty, even with a shake-up in their government and everything else, was getting pretty badly beaten. The separatists were losing pretty substantially until the Russians saw the opportunity and intervened and started supplying them. In fact, when it comes to the MH-17 incident, the MH-17 was shot down by a Buk anti-aircraft system. And this anti-aircraft system was actually transported the day prior to the shooting here at this field. And it was transported the day prior from the Russian Federation's 53rd Anti-Air Missile Brigade to the separatist forces here in the Donbass. And then that missile did fire, hitting MH-17, which was flying over the country. It was within 50 kilometers inside of Ukrainian airspace. It was shot down, and it's considered the worst shoot-down of an airliner in history, with 298 casualties. 283 people were killed on board that were passengers, with another 15 crew. And this is what we're talking about. And they were proud of this. The Russians were very proud of this. Or the separatists were, I should say. As we can see here. These are separatists with the wreckage of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. This is from 2014 here at this crash site. And it's here in the Donetsk Oblast. This is not the reaction a person has when they kill 298 people. It's not. In the whole world, there are a lot of things that you can attribute on both sides. And there are a lot of things that led up to this. But if there was a time for the Russian Federation to stop, if there was ever a time for the Russian Federation to take a look at what was happening and save themselves politically, it would have been in 2014 at the shoot down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. From that photo alone. Because if I was a government, if I was in charge of a government, I would not, in any way, shape, or form, support a group of people that take photos like that. But they have. Not only did they continue to do so for the past 8 years, but then they took it a step further and actually just invaded the country. Under the exact same similar rhetoric to Adolf Hitler invading Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, you start to name it, and anytime that he has had justifications, Adolf Hitler had justifications for taking over these locations, Russia basically, you could just swap out the text in these, and you can literally just swap out, Austria for Ukraine, and, the government for Kiev, or Kiev regime. And it would be almost verbatim what is being said by the Russians. Scarily so. This is what I mean when history tends to repeat itself. History tends to repeat itself for those that actually don't study history, and anyone that does, and to even a minor extent. I am no historian. I have no college professional training on this. So Erevis Chang asked, that was not intentional, right? The shoot down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. So the shoot down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 seems to have been an intentional thing. It does. So based off of what they had at their disposal, and based off of what the scenario surrounding this, it would appear that this was at least an intentional shoot down of an aircraft, of a civilian aircraft, and no, so Erevis Chang also asked, or they thought it was a Ukrainian military plane. No, because once again, if we jump back to this photo, that is not a Ukrainian military plane. This is from 2000. This is a photo from 2014. that very clearly states Malaysia Airlines. Now, if this was something that you had to like, if you thought you shot down a Ukrainian military plane, right? That's okay. Celebrate, right? Like, if I was a separatist, I would celebrate too. But then I walk over to the wreckage of this aircraft and I find out that I shot down an entire airline. I wouldn't be posing with it. I would have that gut of the feeling, immediate realization that I had just done a very, very terrible thing. That's kind of the situation I have with this. You can't, you can't just, you can't have one without the other. That's the thing about this. The actual shoot down, very highly contested. However, an investigative team out of Brussels believes it was an intentional shoot down when they conducted the investigation of the aircraft records in 2014. They believe it was at least intentional because the separatists, based off of what they were given by the Russian military, not only did they receive a Buk system, but they also received radar systems and everything else to go along with this that would have been able to identify the aircraft through its transponder. So all aircraft, all civilian aircraft have transponders. That's why you can go onto things like Flight Radar number 20 or Flight Radar 24. You can track aircraft all across the globe. These transponders are what actually talk to air-to-ground systems, whether that's military or it's civilian. And that's actually how you can identify the aircraft, its altitude, its flight paths, and all of that fun stuff. This obviously probably would have had its transponder on, especially if it's flying over an active situation such as in Ukraine. And the only way to identify something like this would be its transponder talking to the radar system that would be then used to target and track firing this Buk missile at it. This is how these air systems work. They read transponders. They see a flight path. You read the transponder, and then you shoot it down if it doesn't come back as something that needs to be shot down, or if it doesn't come back as something that's friendly or civilian. That's how you target these things. So there's no way in any shape or form that this system should have allowed for the Russian forces to actually, I say Russian forces, they essentially were Russian forces, they're separatists, to not identify this aircraft. They had every means of capability to do so, and either didn't or didn't care. And as we see the war in the Donbass develop, and as we see the war in Ukraine develop, you see this situation, and it's really hard to say it wasn't purposeful when you see what happens following. You see the immediate, you see the actions of it. You see the rhetoric coming from the Russian Federation, because it wasn't coming from the DNR or the LNR. No, there weren't any statements from a DNR, LNR, or the separatists. No, it was from the Russian Federation. So, as we jump over here, this is over Marinka, where we see a flight of Su-25 Frogfoots. The Su-25 is essentially the Russian version of the A-10. It's not as good, but they did produce quite a bit of them, and it serves the same role. It's a low flying, rather slow jet aircraft that provides close air support on the front lines. This is a flight of them, meaning there's 2 ships or 2 aircraft in total. Neither side is operating with localized air support, so this is extremely risky for them. Because there is no air superiority over the entirety of Ukraine. They don't have localized air superiority, is what I mean to say. So not only are their skies contested, they're contested for both sides, and both sides using their aircraft, especially in this close to the front lines, is a very dangerous thing to do. Trying to strike at these targets. And it could incur the loss of the aircraft. And we've seen that time and time and time again throughout the entire duration of this war. but we can see them here operating in support of ground forces. Usually when we see these aircraft being used, it's in this capacity that normally, such as the heavy usage of aircraft up in the Luhansk Oblast, it usually means that either a offensive is getting ready to begin or that an offensive is beginning and they're in support of ground forces they're trying to make a push or an offensive action. You can take a look at that here. And as you can see, right as it gets over top of this individual's house, it immediately fires all of its rockets in a single salvo, and then immediately pops flares and probably starts to break. And that's kind of what you see from all different types of aircraft. They normally do a high angle of fire, especially helicopters will do this. These jets are going fast enough that normally they can just push it up to full throttle, fire these rockets, and immediately bank. You take a few high Gs, but they are. What's going on here is these aircraft, these airframes, they are basically, they're jettisoning all of these rockets all at once. They're going to saturate an area with these explosions, and immediately what you're seeing is they're immediately braking and they are immediately turning around and heading back to base. They're not staying in the airspace long enough. They're going to limit the window that they have for the enemy to shoot them down. And you're going to see that from helicopters where they're doing a very high angle of attack that's extending their range and then immediately doing a break, so they're breaking contact and immediately returning back to base for rearm, refit, refuel. As we move over here into Kherson, we start to see, once again, Mi-24 Hinds. So out of here, the Kherson airport or airbase really hasn't been used pretty extensively. The airbase, which is over by Chernobivka, which is right here, has been targeted repeatedly by Ukrainian forces and continues to be targeted over and over again, suggesting that the Russians are still putting aircraft there and at least supplies and some kind of command and control structure. I don't know how many times you have to hit an airfield before your opponent realizes it's not viable anymore. Initially, several months ago, we actually reported where they took most of their helicopter forces and immediately flew them out of there after some pretty major strikes there, and they moved them over to Chaplinka, over here further on the other side of the Dnieper River, and they set up a field base, and this is Chaplinka right here where my cursor is. And now we're seeing Mi-24 Hinds, which also known as the flying tank very affectionately by its crews, and they're being flown, or it's now being driven through the city of Kherson, suggesting that these things were still at the Kherson airport. And it's pretty ridiculous that they would still have these, but take a look at, that's insane. Why there is no, it doesn't take the most intelligent person, to sit there and take a look and see all the strikes that are happening and be like, guys, stop putting our expensive stuff here. Like, you don't need a lot of, tactical or strategic know-how to go, this is a poor decision. But the Russians do it anyway, much to everyone else's delight. And now we're finally seeing them go, maybe we should stop putting our really expensive helicopters that keep getting shot down anyway. And maybe we should move them away from where they keep being bombed. But this does tell us something. And what this tells us is there's a good possibility that if they are finally moving their attack aircraft, it's one of two things. Option one, someone finally did go, guys, stop putting our expensive shit at this airport. Or I'm going to say option two is that it was no longer, there's a much greater tactical risk involved to these aircraft. And considering the decisions they have made thus far, I'm going to go with option 2 in my personal idea of what is happening. Reportedly, we've heard up until this point that Russian forces were setting up defensive lines. This is rumored, but according to locals out of Kherson and Chernobivka, Russians were setting up defensive lines less than 3 kilometers from the Kherson International Airport, which they were using as a base. We know that Kherson and Novokhovka have received pretty significant amounts of shelling, especially with the use of HIMARS that have struck some very major ammunition depots, including here at Kherson. Novokhovka had a very large one, which we'll actually talk about here later. And the Russians haven't made the best decisions with their military equipment. They did move their transport aircraft farther away, but I can imagine that's because they're not expecting to need to conduct an air assault anytime soon, because we haven't seen them do that, and why would you lose the aircraft you're not even going to use? But these attack aircraft are certainly going to get used much more. And now that they're moving and they're leaving the Kherson airport, from what we can tell, and they're set up 3 kilometers from it, according to locals, that means that there's now enough pressure here in the Kherson Oblast to possibly signify that Ukrainian forces have a very good possibility, or a reasonable possibility, of overrunning the airport, which would mean the capture of this equipment and these aircraft. They would not be able to get off the ground quick enough if the lines broke. This is definitely an opinion, and it is a possibility, but I don't know. We don't have enough information on the ground to say so. But their actions so far seem to suggest this. We see, according to the NASA firms map, we see a drastic decrease in Russian artillery capability just by the amount of fires being picked up over the past now about 10 days. We see major strikes on ammunition and logistical depots. We know that they're also moving a lot of their forces. We know here in the Kherson Oblast that their manpower shortages are so bad that they have now put in those Syrian fighters that nobody, I don't even think Russia, intended to actually use for anything more than propaganda. And we know that they are operating on the front, and the Ukrainians have actually clarified that, yes, the Syrians are fighting here on the front lines. So it seems to me, with the kind of things that are happening in this region, especially with this bulge towards Kherson, this bulge in the line, that there's a good possibility that the situation on the battlefield may have swayed and put the Russian forces in enough of a difficult position that they've realized that the possibility is that Ukrainian forces could break through to at least the Kherson International Airport. Conducting an offensive on Kherson itself would be a very bloody endeavor, I think. Retaking Kherson, I think that's probably going to be one of the bloodiest battles we see in the war when the stage is set for that. I think it will come, but it will be very bloody. I think it will be a very major. It's going to happen, also one of two ways. Either the Russians just retreat across the Dnieper River and blow up the bridges, or Kherson is extremely bloody because they don't want to lose that. They don't want to lose that city. They want to keep that incursion. And so that's kind of what I think we're going to see here. And I think that it is the possibility, just for the fact that they wouldn't probably withdraw their helicopters otherwise. But that's actually it for everything inside of Ukraine today. But there's stuff going on outside of Ukraine, and some of it's up here in Russia, and we have 3 different points here. The HIMARS, and the first thing is, of course, RIA News. So we follow a lot of Russian news media and the Russian official organizations that actually post anything, and that is usually their state-run media organizations. See, in Russia, you have the fake option of choice. You have the fake ability to choose. Because no matter what you choose for your news, it's all state-run media. It's all the same rhetoric. It's all the same thing. It's just who is saying it in front of the screen. And what's happening here is, according to RIA, quoting Lavrov, the HIMARS MLRS systems are being remotely operated to their targets by Western crews. NATO MLRS gunners can direct the actions of the armed forces of Ukraine on the ground. So basically what this media article is implying is that NATO gunners, actual NATO military personnel, are using the Ukrainian forces as pretty much like a decoy. They're there for show. And they're firing these systems, but they're being guided by NATO to their targets. So NATO is the one that's been blowing up all these ammunition depots. But we'll get to why that also contradicts itself here in a second. And the thing is that it doesn't work like that. So the system doesn't work like that. That's an intentional thing. Because if we could do it, the Russians or the Chinese or whoever we're up against could do it too, theoretically. This is why UAVs and drones all have to have their own system. There is no... You cannot just grab any controller for any American UAV and suddenly you can control any UAV that's being operated by the United States as long as you have a code or a key or something. No, each individual drone system in the U.S. military requires to have its own command console controls. You can't use this to hack into another controller. Each one is specific to its system. The reason for this is because that means that each system is independent of a network. None of these are networked together. None of them operate together. That's why you're not seeing quadcopters being used in a massive capacity where you just have like 50 quadcopters together. They're all linked on a network and just one dude can control them all. No, even the Switchblade drone. The Switchblade drone, each one has its own console, its own little control pad. Why? Because if you hack one, you can't hack all of them. You have to hack each one individually. HIMARS is the same thing. Why would I allow the ability? Because it wouldn't take much, technologically, it wouldn't take much to allow someone in another country to control HIMARS. It wouldn't. We do it with drones every single day. But why would I allow? But that would mean either one, I would have to network it, or essentially, or two, I would have to, have a console for each individual missile, which definitely isn't happening. So it's possible, but it wouldn't happen. One, because it breaks all NATO doctrine to do that. And two, because it leaves the open capability that Russians could now, say, hack into the console of a NATO force, and now all of a sudden they have a HIMARS from Ukraine at their disposal firing this thing, and they can just fire it themselves and target the very vehicle that they're intending to fire with. It's just not possible. So there is no like NATO gunners or anything for the HIMARS or for the M270. Like, no one is remotely operating this. It has to be the Ukrainians. They are the only ones capable of doing this. Otherwise, you're just falsely misunderstanding how this thing works in the first place. And two, you're trying to justify having a war with NATO, which that in and of itself is a terrible idea, because it'd be 32 on 1, and that's not good odds. That's worse than Hitler had, and Hitler didn't do very well. So yeah, pretty bad odds. But it also, they go on here, and most of the news coming out of there, HIMARS is the buzzword in Russia right now. They claim, this is coming from Taz, once again, you have the false option of choice. Russia claims to have destroyed a HIMARS launcher and a reloading vehicle in the missile strike in Odessa. The problem is we had video footage of the missile strike in Odessa, and they didn't. So it was a depot source for Harpoon missiles destroyed in Odessa, according to Russia's top brass. A U.S.-made HIMARS launcher, resupply vehicle were also destroyed. The problem with that is that there was no sympathetic detonation, which we're getting ready to get into. So if you want to go back and take a look at yesterday's footage, you certainly can once you're done watching this. But if you go back to Odessa, there's fire, there's smoke, there's a lot of stuff burning. Like, there's definitely a missile strike in the city of Odessa, a very, very highly concentrated civilian population. But there's no follow-on explosions. So if there was a bunch of Harpoon missiles and a bunch of HIMARS missiles and everything else going on inside that warehouse, those would all be cooking off and exploding. And I'll show you what I mean, because our next bit of news out of here is Ukraine is targeting civilians, apparently, according to the Russians. So JLS, so all HIMARS are alive. So there's been a lot of talk about this. And that's the thing, is probably so I've seen all sorts of stuff about, HIMARS is destroyed today. Oh, HIMARS has been destroyed. We heard this the other day when it was actually just a transport truck. It just has a similar front end look to a HIMARS. And it was all a bunch of Russian media chatter. And no, they didn't destroy HIMARS there. It was a tow truck for an M777. They got an M777. They didn't get a HIMARS. There's also, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, by the way, because these things don't have to be anywhere close to the front lines for them to use them. I mean, the HIMARS has stupid amounts of range. And third, no, because we would have seen a sympathetic detonation, and we're getting ready to look at some sympathetic detonations, so you'll see what I mean here in a second. So what we're getting ready to take a look at here is that they're saying Ukraine is using HIMARS to target civilians, and it's pretty insane. So here's a Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement coming from their spokesperson that is regarding the Ukrainian usage of HIMARS, and she's going to talk about specifically Novokhovka, and we have the footage from that. So get ready for this. Very long, I know. It's 3 minutes and 11 seconds of BS. But here's the thing. None of that was true. Maybe some of the civilian casualties. But none of that is the Ukrainians' fault. See, the HIMARS is extremely accurate. The HIMARS system is actually so accurate, it will put a missile between me and my microphone. Within 1 meter of its intended target. That's how accurate a HIMARS is. So, in order to actually kill civilians in this kind of a quantity, one, you need a massive amount of missiles. And two, you would have to purposefully target these locations. That's what Russia's implying. However, we know that that's not the case because I went through and I pulled our archival footage. So these are the different strikes that she talks about. Kadivka, Kherson, Novokakhovka, Luhansk, Novokakhovka again, and the Russian response to Novokakhovka, which, by the way, I want you to remember this for Novokakhovka. She just said that there was ammonium nitrate and medical supplies at those warehouses. Ammonium nitrate, which is a fertilizer, and a very explosive fertilizer, and medical supplies. We'll get to that here in a second. First of all, this is the Ukrainian strike on the city of on the ammunition depot in Kadivka. This occurred 2 days ago on the 15th. Okay, not convinced? That's fine. Here's the strike on Kherson on the 14th. That's a little bit bigger than a HIMARS. Still not convinced? Here's Novokakhovka on the 13th. See, you can see the fire out there, but don't worry, we actually have some video footage of this too. Still not convinced. Okay. Here's Luhansk. This is on the 11th and the 12th. You see that? Here, I'll replay it for you. That's a rocket coming out of this thing. Still not convinced. That's fine. And there's even more regarding Luhansk. This is even closer. And then the cream of the crop. The cream of the spicy fireworks of the crop. They said that this was ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is extremely explosive. Ammonium nitrate, I'm actually going to jump here real quick. Ammonium nitrate is extremely explosive. It's used as a fertilizer. I mean, stupid explosive. Most places have extreme restrictions on ammonium nitrate. In the United States, you have to have an AA and E, or Arms, Ammunitions, and Explosives certification as a truck driver, which means you also have to be armed as a truck driver just to carry this stuff. And then you also, in order to carry ammonium nitrate, have to have a armed escort vehicles with you to transport it. That's how dangerous this stuff is. Ammonium nitrate is used heavily in the making of homemade explosive, or HME, that was used in IEDs throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. Extremely explosive, except there's one problem with that statement. They didn't say it was ammonium nitrate. They said it was saltpeter. A saltpeter is completely different from ammonium nitrate. Saltpeter is not explosive by itself. In fact, saltpeter is extremely unexplosive by itself. In order to become an explosive agent, saltpeter requires a reducing agent. So, not only, this is an official statement, by the way. This is coming from the Russian embassy in the United Kingdom. So, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is contradicting themselves, because the Russian embassy is run by the Foreign Affairs. So they're contradicting themselves in this single statement. Here, which it took them a full day to come to this understanding, because they didn't state it until the 12th. They took them almost a full day to release a statement on the huge blast that occurred, and they said saltpeter. Now they're calling it ammonium nitrate and medicine. And you're about to see the explosion. This thing is the definition of spicy fireworks. This is immense. This is insanely huge as an explosion. This is terrifying as an explosion. So just take a look. This is Novakovka. This is the first strike that occurred. Hey, look, it's the very location in Novakovka, and they leave a. This is the end of the blast. This is after the blast. This is the next day. This is the 12th. This is after everything has been destroyed. This is Novakovka, and it's. Let me tell you, they certainly had a lot of 152 millimeter canisters of ammonium nitrate or saltpeter or whatever medicine. They had a lot of 152 millimeter canisters of medicine, let me tell you. Just take a look. That's the very famous photo of the blast in Novakovka. So you have to think. We know what ammonium nitrate does. Look at the blast that occurred in Lebanon. That was ammonium nitrate. Everyone knows that was ammonium nitrate, and it was huge, and it was one warehouse of ammonium nitrate. If they had that much ammonium nitrate, there wouldn't be a Novakovka. There wouldn't. And what Ukraine stated that they hit was S-300 and S-400 missiles, which, to be fair, the city of Mykolaiv had just been hit with S-300 and S-400 missiles, I believe 2 days prior to this. They received six S-300, S-400 missiles. The S-300, S-400 missile batteries are anti-air batteries and the Russians have retrofitted them in order to be able to hit. Basically, they're now homemade cruise missiles because they're depleting their stockpiles. So the Russians have stated, of course, that the Ukrainians are targeting civilian locations. This is the Russians essentially being essentially the Russians being the schoolyard bully. And he just pulled the fat kid off of the playground, and the fat kid just sucker punched him in the face and broke his nose. And he's mad about that. That is essentially what is happening right now. Is Russia just got sucker punched in the face, and their nose just got broken and it's bloodied. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now. That's what's happening. And they're upset because they're going, you can't just blow up our ammunition depots. And Ukraine's kind of like, well, yeah, you can. It's not our fault. It's not our fault. We're really accurate. And you put them all in civilian populations because, unfortunately for them, the Russians are going to call this a war crime. And the problem with that is that these strikes actually aren't a war crime. Now, we've talked about some of the things regarding strikes and war crimes regarding strikes. Under Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, the strike, the means and the method of the strike must be used in a way that mitigates civilian casualties and civilian loss of life. However, also under the Geneva Convention, it states that the presence of civilians does not inherently mean that it can no longer be struck and it's no longer considered a military target or a valid target. It's not about the fact that civilian casualties aren't going to happen. The Geneva Convention understands this. There isn't a zero tolerance policy in a war. I hate to break it to you. Not everything is a war crime. Stop putting your ammunition depots in civilian populations. Stop putting them in Donetsk. Stop putting them in Kherson. Stop putting them in Novokhovka. This is the third time we've seen Novokhovka hit with an ammunition depot. Stop putting them in Luhansk, in Severodonetsk, in Lysychansk, in Mykolaiv, and wherever else. Just stop doing it. Because what's happening is this stuff isn't being put into, these rounds aren't being put into a chamber or into a tube or into a breach like they normally would. So when they're getting hit, the explosion or the fire created because of that explosion is causing these rounds to cook off, and they're going in every single direction imaginable. Every single one of them. These aren't, they'll do whatever they want. They're not even being aimed in a general direction, let alone guided. They're just going off. They're just exploding. And they're just being shot everywhere. Sometimes kilometers. This is inherently dangerous for anyone living near it. Inherently. And you see the immense amount of destruction that something like that causes. But it's a valid military target because that much ammunition would be used against, as we've clearly seen, Mykolaiv, Vinnytsia, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa. That is what these targets are being used for. So therefore, under the Geneva Convention, the means and the method of attack limits civilian casualties. They used the most accurate weapon system they had. The HIMARS, accurate within 1 meter. That minimizes civilian casualties. They struck military targets, which are ammunition depots, meaning that they did not hit civilian populations. That means it's not a war crime. They hit a military target. They clearly identified, and hit a military target even though it's within a civilian population. Not only this, but the reason for any civilian casualties likely is not a result of the HIMARS itself due to its accuracy, but is a likelihood that the consequences of having an ammunition depot at a military target inherently mean that within a civilian population, all of these rounds going everywhere is now killing civilians. which, by the way, because you're putting an ammunition depot or a fuel depot or something like this inside a civilian population, that is a war crime because it breaks Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, requiring that to the best of your country's ability, you put military objectives outside of a civilian population in order to prevent shit like this. Don't believe me? Go read the Geneva Conventions. Go read the protocols of the Geneva Conventions. There are 3 of them. You don't have to listen to me on that issue. You can go read it yourself. They're public. The UN has them. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintains them on their websites. The International Committee of the Red Cross also maintains customary international humanitarian law on their website. So you can go read all of the laws of humanitarian law, which also recovers most of this. It redoubles down on the Geneva Conventions. And it's all publicly available. I implore you to please go do this, because that is why I can't stand the rhetoric here. Ukraine is not targeting civilians. You're just mad. You're just mad, and people are dying because you're mad. And because you're stupid. The Russians would probably have a much better time of putting these things in an open field and covering them with bushes than putting them in warehouses. You suck at logistics. You finally got your logistics figured out, and the Ukrainians are blowing the hell out of it. And unfortunately, it's causing civilian lives, but it would definitely be less civilian lives than if you were to fire these, which we already know what targets you're going to use these against. I mean, just look at the firm's fire map. It's ridiculous how much Russia has been limited in their artillery capabilities from the destruction of these ammunition depots. They can't keep up the rate of fire they were, and now you can't. Oh wow! Now we've prevented you from killing a lot of civilians and wiping villages clean off the map. I'm sorry that all of your Tor 1 quote-unquote aerosol bomb, vacuum bomb, flamethrower tank rockets have been destroyed. I'm sorry that your immense amounts of white phosphorus and incendiary munitions have been destroyed in these attacks. I'm sorry that your immense amount of artillery, your standard artillery, high explosive artillery rounds, your smoke rounds, your illumination rounds, your rocket artillery, your grad rockets, your 122 millimeter Katyushas are all being destroyed. Your S-300 and S-400 batteries that you have retrofitted to hit ground targets instead of air targets have been destroyed. And that your cruise missiles are being destroyed. That is what's happening here. I am so sorry that Ukraine has decided that they are done with your shit and have decided to blow up all of your fancy ammunition. And they're mad about it. And they also don't understand, according to this article, they don't understand how these systems work to begin with. And they want to justify a war with NATO. They also said that they destroyed a HIMARS. I just showed you multiple instances of what happens when you hit ammunition. You notice how that stuff is all of a sudden a bunch of stuff's blowing up around it? Did we see that with Kherson? Did we hear it with Kherson? No. We didn't. That's how I know that there weren't any Neptune missiles there. That's how I know there weren't any HIMARS missiles there. Because it would have made a much bigger boom and there would have been a lot of them. They just hit a warehouse. Probably killed some innocent civilians. I don't know the death toll. But it's Odessa. And that's it. And Ukraine isn't killing civilians. You are, because you're purposely using people as a human shield, thinking it's going to work. U.S. weaponry has the capability of putting a round through your window from halfway across the world. A drone pilot can put a missile through the window of a terrorist's house, blow up his one room, his bedroom, kill him and whoever is laying in bed next to him, if anybody. And nobody is going to be the wiser except for his neighbors and the very, very, very upset apartment neighbors above and below him, who would really like it if he turned down all the racket. And this very same type of weaponry is being given to Ukraine. It is the most accurate, precise weaponry meant specifically for minimizing civilian casualties after fighting for 30 years against terrorist organizations all over the Middle East. Because unlike Russia, the United States and NATO countries and coalition have been fighting conflicts throughout the world and therefore have had to continue military development past of what the Russians have been doing. And the Russians have just been trying to rip off their own stuff or try to counter NATO stuff, and they're not very good at it because they haven't had to fight a war against NATO to actually need to adjust their stuff. They don't know what it's capable of. They don't know the difference. I mean, we've seen it here. They don't know the difference between a used javelin and an unused javelin. I don't think they realize you can't reload a javelin missile tube. We've seen them capture spent missile tubes and spent rockets. It's not an RPG, guys. You can't reload it. Congratulations, you have officially captured a carbon tube. It's spent, it's useless. The battery on it, the battery of argon gas isn't even useful. It's empty. It's spent. They don't understand. I don't think they understand the capabilities that Ukraine has now. The HIMARS system is the deadliest weapon system for Russian forces, and we already see the repercussions of this being fielded in a very small quantity, and they're getting more of them. And that's not even to say the M270s that they have just now gotten. This capability is expanding. It's expanding rapidly. It's already been war-changing for them with the limited capacity they have, let alone when they get more of them. This is very much could be a very big turning point in the war. A lot of people hypothesize that, and I think it's very true. But Russia is just mad about it. They're just mad about it. Jumping down here into Greece, we get the first look at a crash site. A Ukrainian AN-12 crashed, making an attempt to emergency land here in Greece. It crashed just outside of Peleokori, which is near Kavala, and it was apparently carrying ammunition on board from Serbia, and it ended up crashing here, and it was pretty disastrous, to say the least. It's not a lot of information. I've heard that both pilots have been killed, from my understanding, which was pretty, I think everyone kind of expected that. But both pilots have been killed. The crash site is pretty extensive. And as we can tell, the crash site is roughly about 250 meters long, based off of geolocation and where the transponder lost complete signal here in according to different flight trackers. So, but there's not much left of this aircraft. You can go ahead and take a look here. There is no audio with this, unfortunately, but you can see it is a pretty extensive crash site. There is not much left of the aircraft. You do not see rescuers in this footage. At this point, it was understood that this aircraft had been carrying ammunition aboard, so quite a bit of ammunition, in fact. So at this point, rescue workers, after identifying this, pulled back, and when this video was being taken, they are waiting on EOD, explosive ordnance disposal personnel, to go in there and make sure that the area was safe for rescue workers to come back. Rescue workers are back on site and are currently sifting through the wreckage. From my understanding, both bodies have been recovered of the pilots, and that basically continues. Jump up here into Geneva. According to the United Nations headquarters here in Geneva, 1.5 million children have been born as refugees whether that's being as internally displaced people or IDPs or abroad from their homelands between the years of 2018 and 2021. And this comes as the refugee crisis here in the world continues to really go downhill on the daily. It's extremely terrible. The refugee crisis across the world, for all of these situations combined, this is the highest amount of refugees and internally displaced people in recorded history at any point in time in this world. And that's on a global scale, according to the United Nations. 5.1 or 1.5 million children born into being a refugee between 2018 and 2021. That doesn't include the figures that will be coming out from this year. And this year has been a big year for refugee crises. I mean, you're talking about the worst drought in 40 years for Ethiopia and Somalia and the Horn of Africa. You're talking about a record-setting drought and famine in Iraq. You're talking about the crippling situation in Haiti, which we'll get into. You're talking about Ukraine. You're talking about, you name it. The continual rise of the Islamic State in Africa. It's just getting worse daily. So please check out the description. You can help with this. That's why we're the news that gives back. Jump down here into the Middle East. Here in Jeddah, the Jeddah summit concluded today. There was a joint and final statements that were made regarding this. Many of what occurred here at this meeting, it was the first of its kind. This is the first time that so many Middle Eastern countries, as well as the United States, had actually come together and talked about security and differences. Flights opened up between Saudi Arabia and Israel for the very first time, meaning obviously there were some deals that were happening there, and that's breaking breaking up a lot of stuff when it comes to history. It's breaking down a lot of barriers there, and hopefully that leads to a lot more. Just having this meeting alone is very important. This symbolizes that there is an understanding within the Middle East that maybe they need to talk about actually having meaningful gains and stability. A lot of this is because of continued aggression from Iran, which we're getting ready to get into. But a lot of this is also they have been in an unstable region for some time, and they need to become even more. They need to stabilize. If they want to be able to survive in the modern world, they need to stabilize their region and economies. And they released a lot of affirmations on already existing treaties. That's pretty much what this entire. This is the final statement regarding this. This is coming directly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Saudi Arabia, who is hosting this. And they talk about, leaders affirmed their joint vision. President Biden affirmed the U.S. commitment. They recommended this initiative. They committed to this, to enhancing this regional cooperation. They affirmed the importance of achieving energy security. They renewed their support. They renewed their condemnation. The leaders condemned in strongest terms terrorist activity. They expressed their full support for Iraq's sovereignty. They welcomed the truce in Yemen. It's just a lot of reaffirmations, but it's a lot of reaffirmations from everyone all at once. And that's important because this region is, for the last several thousand years, probably one of the most, unstable regions in history. I mean, obviously, colonialism did not help that fact whatsoever. That colonialism was probably one of the worst things to happen to the Middle East in history. You could say the same with Africa, but the Middle East too. I mean, anywhere really, but colonialism absolutely destroyed any semblance of stabilization that this region could have. But for thousands of years, the Middle East has been fighting over things, mostly a lot of ethnic and religious tension. You have several different sects when it comes to Islam here, and they're fighting constantly. That's a lot of the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran is a different sect of Islam than Saudi Arabia is. So there's a lot of fighting between Shia and Sunni Muslims You also have Shiites, and then you also have now, it's starting in 1948. You have Israel, which is Jewish, which are the survivors of the Holocaust that came there. And that really screwed up this whole region's stability. Everyone felt bad for the Jewish people, but no one wanted them here. And Palestine was already a country here. Now that is already not a good situation. We've talked quite extensively about Israel and reported on a lot of stuff happening in Israel as a result of that. And that's been ongoing since 1948. There's a lot of wars that have happened about that. The 6 Days War, for instance, in which Israel absolutely demolished all of their neighbors in a war. But there's just, and then of course you have the first and second Gulf War. You have the civil war in Syria. You have Jordan. You have Kuwait, which was invaded. You have the Iran-Iraq war. You have this Turkish incursion into Syria. You have the Turkish incursion into Iraq. You have you're talking about the war in Afghanistan. You're talking about the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and creating the caliphate. You have them getting kicked out of power. You have them retaking Afghanistan. You have the civil war in Yemen. Then you have the Saudis building a coalition going into Yemen. Then you have the Islamic State, Al Qaeda. You have Kataib Hezbollah, the IRGC. You could just start naming off of. You have Hezbollah. You have Hamas. It's like a power. It's just a power vacuum that just existed for some time. You have the Kurds and the Arabs do not get along. And then you have the Turks too. They don't get along. Like, no one gets along in this region. It's hotly contested. You have Armenia and Azerbaijan that went to war. The Middle East is just a screwed up place. And that's just the modern era. I mean, that's not even including things like the Hittites and the Assyrians and everything else, in ancient time. In ancient times, you're talking about the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and stuff within this region. There's quite a bit of history within this region, but a lot of it is just groups of people not getting along based off of ethnic, religious, and cultural lines. And it's the modern age now, and fortunately for most of the world, unfortunately for a lot of these countries, those indifferences didn't go away because different lines on a map got drew at the end of colonial powers. And that caused a lot of situations. Incursions and interventions didn't help. Wars and terrorism did not help. And now they're trying to realize that, wow, Iran is really being a jackass in this modern age. We should probably all rebuild our security, probably become some very, try and become a prosperous nations. And actually have some kind of stability here where we stop fighting and killing each other. And it's pretty important to understand this. Because when we get to talking about the Middle East, especially because of the last 20 years, there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of Islamophobia too. There's a lot of controversy in what's been going on. And I have my own opinions after spending some time there. I've spent over a year in the Middle East, personally. And I don't fully understand the situations. I'm not going to pretend to. And there's obviously a lot of cultural differences that I may not understand, being an American myself. But I tried to learn the best I could, and I tried to at least be cognizant. I believed, if I was going to be fighting extremists, I need to at least understand, what their philosophy was. Like, what makes them so radical? Why would someone be pushed to this extreme? And so I studied a lot in Iraqi and Syrian culture and in Islam and stuff like that, and I found many things very beautiful about it. When you're talking about the morning at Hans, it's immensely beautiful if you ever heard it, especially if you hear it in person, and even more so with some of those other Hans that are being sung or chanted around times, around special religious times, the times of Eid and things like that. But it is very peaceful and very soothing. And the people are very polite. They're very nice people in general. Very, very nice. I can't say enough good things about them. The people in Kuwait and Syria and in Iraq, they were extremely nice to me. They were never they never were hateful to me, except for the ones that were extremists or Iranian backed. And to explain Iran here, which we're getting ready to get into, Iran has responded through its state-run media agency. This is coming from Press TV. Press TV is Iran's state-sponsored media. Much like Russia has RIA and TAZ and everything else, Iran has Press TV. They said if security measures were put in throughout the region as a result of the Jeddah conference, essentially, that Iran would respond in turn to them. I'm going to take a look at this here. Iran will respond in kind to any measures against national security. That's coming from a senior diplomat. What does this mean? Well, Iran is like the Russia of the Middle East. It really is. If there's a point to say that if there's a point in which you can make the comparison, Iran is kind of like the Russia of the Middle East. The situation with Iran is very specific. Iran and Iraq has fought a war. Iran is one of the few countries in the world that's considered a theocracy. They have what they call the Ayatollah, who's the supreme leader of Iran. That's above the prime minister and the president. The Ayatollah is in charge of Iran. He has been ordained by Muhammad and Allah, and he is, that is where he gets his power and everything. He's the supreme leader of Iran. That's all that means. And Iran has several different things that cause issues. One, they're trying to get nuclear weapons. No one thinks Iran having a nuclear bomb is an amazing idea. Turkmenistan doesn't think that. Armenia and Azerbaijan don't think that. Turkey doesn't think that. Iraq doesn't think that. Kuwait, who's sitting down here with a shit ton of oil, does not think that's a good idea. Saudi Arabia, who hates Iran based off of a lot of things, mostly a lot of background religious tension, considering these two are two opposite ends of the spectrum religiously in Islam. They do not like each other. And that does not make Saudi Arabia very enthusiastic. But Iran is also very adamant about expanding their sphere of influence. And this is what has destabilized a lot of the region. And partially because they took advantage of power vacuums created by interventions throughout the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s within this region. Kataib Hezbollah, who is a group inside of Iraq, they are a militia forces. They are, what they do is they are basically a militia inside of Iraq, and they are trained by Iran. They're an Iranian-backed terror organization, and they hate Americans, essentially. They are the ones who fought against the United States during the occupation period and the insurgencies within Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah and other groups and insurgencies. Not all of them were Iranian-backed, but several of them were, especially the larger ones, and they fought against the United States and Iraqi security forces. Iran has also used them to influence in a military capacity inside of Iran. They are the ones that attacked the United States Embassy in 2020, which I had the wonderful, magnificent experience of being a part of. And they are the ones that fired rockets at us. What you don't know regarding the assassination of General al-Soleimani, who is the head of the Quds force for Iran, he was killed at the Baghdad International Airport, which is about 5 miles away from the Baghdad embassy. And he was meeting, they talk about him. They talk about the killing of al-Soleimani, and there's a lot of controversy. A lot of people were upset that we assassinated somebody. But what he was doing is no one talks about the other guy in the car. And the other guy in the car was actually the head of Kataib Hezbollah. They were meeting together in order to plan a further attack, an armed attack to overrun the embassy and kill the Americans inside and force the Americans out of the green zone and out of Baghdad. That's why we killed him. Like, I was there. I watched it happen with my own eyes. I watched the drone strike. Like, that's why we killed him. I was standing on post when it happened. So, And it's true. When the guys in the back of the crowd, everyone talks about the crowd that was throwing all these rocks and everything. There were guys in the back of the crowd with AK-47s and RPGs that all they were waiting for were for us to give them a reason to start opening fire. And we were getting Molotov cocktails thrown at us, and people were using, 2000 BC slingshots to throw, marbles and stuff and hit us in the face. And some people got injured doing this. And then Katiba Hezbollah proceeded to shell us for a month and a half straight with rockets and mortars. So that's just one instance. They try to influence the government inside of Iraq. When I was in Syria on my first deployment, there was reportedly about 70,000 Iranian fighters who took this highway. And what this highway is, it runs from basically all the way from Syria, and or all the way from Iran. It runs through here, and then they catch it on outside of Baghdad. They take Highway 1, and it runs just past Jordan, which is why the U.S. has forces in Jordan for training purposes, of course, and to fight the Islamic State. But there's Highway 1 that runs through here, and it runs into Syria, which also happens to be the part of Syria that is under control of the Syrian government, essentially. That's still under their control, which means that they have a lot more freedom of movement, considering Iran and Syria are both kind of Middle East, or they're both kind of Middle Eastern allies, or at least acquaintances with Russia, and Russia is operating inside this region as well, with like nothing more to destabilize the coalition's efforts inside of Syria. And that's just a couple of instances from my own personal experience. That's not even to get into the whole thing. But that's just 2 instances. Oh, and we could also talk about how they supplied the Houthi rebels here in Yemen to fight Saudi Arabian coalition after the Houthi rebels overthrew the government and massacred everybody inside of Sana'a and all this fun stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on, but generally speaking, the situation with Iran is not a good one, and everyone in the region kind of hates them. If they're not like Syria. Syria is about the only one that doesn't hate Iran. Iraq hates Iran. Saudi Arabia hates Iran. Kuwait does. The UAE, Oman, like Egypt, like everyone hates Iran, but Syria, essentially. And Iran has no problems. They fired missiles at the United States. They fire missiles. They constantly set attacks against American forces, coalition forces, Iraqi forces. I mean, it's just a long list of issues, but that's about as oversimplified as I could make that entire cluster of a situation, because whoa man, it's very, very involved. It's very complicated. We jump down here into Australia, where B-2 Spirit bombers are now operating in the Pacific. For those that don't know, the B-2 Spirit is a stealth bomber. It's that very famous large stealth bomber that the United States operates, and it's coming to Australia as part of rotational forces that are here inside of the Pacific. But it's also a very key message. This key message is directed probably towards China, of all places, and we can kind of know why. Because over the last few months, the rhetoric regarding Taiwan has really heated up from China, and then positioning these very high-capacity, nuclear-capable, strategic stealth bombers inside of Australia is kind of a power play. And these things easily would be able to strike China or Chinese forces trying to take Taiwan if need be, if that was the case. So that's kind of the whole point here, and this is actually coming from the U.S. Air Force. And that is the B-2 Spirit bomber. And as they say here, guess who's back? The Whiteman Air Force Base airmen are deployed to the Australian Air Force's RAF Amberley in Australia in support of the Pacific Air Force Initiative Bomber Task Force deployment. We are committed to a free and open Pacific. There's only one country in the Pacific that would be denoted to, and that would be China, who is the other. That is the yin to the yang. Russia is Europe, and China is the Pacific. Essentially, when it comes to near-peer adversaries. We jump over here because, unfortunately, I didn't find a lot of information or anything here in Africa or in South America, but we do have something over here and that is coming out of Port-au-Prince. So a lot of the main themes that we do with this channel is the fact we talk about a lot about humanitarian crises. And when we talk about humanitarian crises, we're usually not talking about good things. And the situations in a lot of countries that are either unstable, or they are currently in a conflict area, or they're being massively affected with climate change, is the fact that millions of people are suffering, usually from inability to find clean water or water in general, or also get food. And that's where the World Food Program comes in a lot of places, as well as many other humanitarian organizations. Port-au-Prince is a location completely surrounded by gangs in Haiti. None of them are so the only way to get food from Haiti or from Port-au-Prince is to take a boat out to sea and then go to another part of Haiti. That's it. You can't leave through the road networks out of Port-au-Prince. And there are thousands of people suffering from malnutrition. Haiti is not a good political situation or economic situation or anything at all. Devastated by an earthquake, ravaged by gangs, already had economic and political issues. This does not help. And the food crisis continues to worsen daily here. This is coming from the UN World Food Program's country director for Haiti, Jean-Martin Bauer. So if you want to take a look here, this is him regarding the food situation here in Haiti. And that really talks about kind of the whole point of what we do here on the channel. And that's being the news that gives back. A lot of these situations have ramifications. We talked about collateral hunger through the World Food Program. We've talked about a lot of these things. The whole point of this project of doing the news, being the new news, is to be an unbiased, or at least clearly stated bias, and also an apolitical independent news source. And the number two thing, and which is truly the number one, is the fact that we want to be the news that gives back. 100% of what we do is for charity. Everyone volunteers to do this. No one is, making any money. I'm not making money off of this. No one on the team is making money off of this. We don't get, a cut of anything. Everything we do is for humanitarian organizations, and to support, obviously, like the war effort in Ukraine, because we have a clearly stated bias for Ukraine. We clearly have openly said that here on the channel, and we will continue to do so. And that's kind of the situation, and that's kind of what we are trying to do here. We want to help people throughout the world. And this is whether you're talking about the World Food Program's efforts here in Haiti, or you're talking about efforts going on inside of Ukraine. Ethiopia and Somalia are going through the worst drought they've ever seen in 40 years. Most of this affects children under the age of 5. And we want to try and turn that around. They just have the first humanitarian cargo shipment going into the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which is up here in the north. This is the Tigray region. There's been heavy fighting and insurgencies throughout this region. It's made it very difficult, but 90% of people inside the Tigray region require humanitarian assistance for survival. 90% of people in 90% of Somalia does not have water access right now because of the drought. 90% of Somalia is dry. There is no water. And that's what we're talking about on this channel. So when he's talking about, there's 1 million people just in Port-au-Prince that are suffering from acute food insecurities, meaning they can't get food. There's 4.5 million people, which is half of Haiti's population alone, that is suffering from acute malnutrition or acute food insecurity. It doesn't include the food insecurities in Syria or Somalia or Ethiopia or here in Haiti, or it only includes Haiti. It doesn't include anywhere else in the world. It's 4.5 million people just here in Haiti, a small Caribbean country in the Gulf. And that's it. Just this one small Caribbean country. It doesn't even take up the whole island. It takes up less than half of an island. It takes up like a third of the entire island. It shares it with the Dominican Republic. That is terrible. And that's what we want to help. So please be sure to check out the video description. And if you have more stuff, if you have more organizations, please, our Discord link is in the description too. Please reach out to a staff member on Discord and shoot us a link and a short summary of like a humanitarian organization that we can go through and vet to make sure like it is a legitimate organization and that 80% of the proceeds actually go to their programs, because we want to actually make a meaningful impact on people's lives. And we also want to make sure that people are held accountable too for causing situations like this, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine, which has been past the point of this is why war shouldn't be fought in the 21st century. And the good news of the day is also a good point. And that is because today is International Criminal Justice Day. On today in 1998, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, was established under the Rome Statute. That means that it is the only internationally accredited criminal court in the world to prosecute war crimes, to prosecute crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and that sort of thing. Currently, they are investigating at least 17 ongoing situations globally, including the war in Ukraine. And this is coming from the United Nations. So, very important. These kind of efforts, what's going on, is extremely important to global rule of law and global security. And that's the good news tonight, is the fact that there is a process. There is a process for actually getting people to be held accountable. And they are holding people accountable in at least 17 different situations, not just the war in Ukraine, but in places like in Africa where groups are using child soldiers, where there's ethnic cleansing ongoing. They are still putting people away right now. They just got done deliberating and actually putting someone in prison for the Rwandan genocide. People are being held accountable. I mean, Nazis are still being prosecuted for standing guard at a concentration camp, and these guys are getting up there. They're almost 100 in some cases, and we're still prosecuting that. Whether it's now, whether it's in the next month or the next few years, the next decades, it doesn't matter. Justice doesn't stop because of time. Justice stops when all the people who require to be prosecuted are either dead, or they're found guilty and rotting in a prison, or they're executed, which, once again, I go back to number one, they're dead. So that's the situation, and that's kind of a good, hopeful light that 20 years ago, 20 odd years ago, a group of people came together and said, we need to make sure that we can hold people accountable. So fantastic. 22 years, and hopefully many, many more, with many, many more cases of injustices being brought before it and being taken care of. But that's actually the news of the night. I hope that you guys have enjoyed. Obviously, it's a lot of good things to talk about. It's a lot of really bad things. And I hope that I was able to explain some of the geopolitical situations, even the more complex ones, in some kind of a understandable way. I understand I'm not an expert in geopolitics, but I have spent time in some of these places, and I do understand at least some military tactics, considering I was in the military for some time. So I try to explain some of these situations and try to put an emphasis on some of this stuff to really kind of make you understand the importance of it. There are some things that we will never change, and people are in general going to have differences. The thing is that we need to remain open and understanding and be willing to listen as much as we are willing to speak. A lot of things I've been hit on that are pretty terrible. A lot of the situations in the Middle East, a lot of the stuff that's ongoing here inside of Ukraine, and a lot of questionable and controversial things is based off of things that aren't generally good when it comes to just us as being human beings. A lot of it is people not willing to listen. A lot of it is having racial or racist tendencies, or stereotyping, or not understanding basic rights. Having a right for something isn't necessarily meant to be popular. It's just meant to be the right thing. And that's the whole kind of spiel I have on that is, don't be racist. Study history. Do your own research. And listen as much as you want to talk. Because I promise you, listening, if you take a few more seconds to think about what's going through your head or what someone is telling you, and not instead of taking it as face value, you might begin to understand the world just a little bit more, and to understand your fellow man or woman or individual or human being in general. And with that, I wrap up for the rest of the news for the night. I hope that you guys have enjoyed. I hope that you guys will be back on Tuesday, because we are not streaming tomorrow. Tomorrow is our day off. We take Mondays off here, mostly because work is extremely rough for me on Mondays usually. And I need a break. I'm not a robot. I can't do this every single night, guys. But we will be back on Tuesday with a 48 hours of a review regarding the news. And I hope that you guys will join us then. If you could, please check out the video description, and please check out all the organizations we have down there. And we are constantly looking for more. That's the whole point of this. This is all we want to do, is we just want to support these organizations. We also are never going to do super chats. We're never going to push merchandising. The only thing we're ever going to be doing on this channel, when it comes to if we get large enough for getting monetization, quote unquote, is the fact we're actually going to be putting fundraisers onto the stream when we're capable of doing that. And that's just because we want to be able to, we want to make it even easier to give to these organizations. So please continue to help us in that endeavor, and help them in their endeavors as well. If you can't give a lot to these organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, as cheesy as it sounds, give us a like and subscribe, and let your friends know about us. The more people that know and that end up coming here, the more good we can do overall. And ultimately, that is the whole goal, is to be able to be the news that gives back, and you guys allow us to do that. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for supporting these organizations, and thank you, of course, for supporting the channel. I hope that you guys have a fantastic rest of your night. You have a fantastic Monday and Tuesday, and we will see you back again on Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central. My name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic rest of your night and an early start to your week.